that's okay though.
Okay,
At least it's all taken care of, and then you'll have to close out of this,
okay.
because you'll get a feedback.
Oh,
You'll
Okay.
just close out of this YouTube
that's
page.
okay though. Okay,
Oh, we are not muted.
good to know. Wait. I don't
On
need
the
that.
Zoom one. I'm gonna close out all of that.
This too?
Yep.
This.
Yep.
Oh, this one here.
And let's just wait a second. We're still just shy of a quorum here, I believe.
Yep, and we should have at least a couple more folks coming, so
Hi, Don.
give it a couple.
Hey, Dave. I know that Shane Morrissey from Planning Board is about to join, so should have at least one more voting member.
Great. Hi, Jordan. Are you filling in for the mayor today?
Hi, Dave. Yeah, I'm proxy for the mayor.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's go ahead and get rolling. Shane can jump in whenever he arrives. So, and there's Shane. Welcome, Shane. So, yeah, I'll go ahead and call today's February 16th meeting of TPCC to order. Let's start out with a roll call. Mirta?
Present.
Mirta. And filling in as proxy for the mayor, Jordan Hess.
Present.
Don MacArthur.
Present.
Ryan, I'm assuming you're filling in for Lucia.
Indeed, I am.
That's Ryan Hammond. Josh Lotnick,
I'm here.
Commissioner, welcome. And this is Dave Strohmeyer. I am here. Anyone from MDT? Bob Boson, are you out there?
I think we have Vicky and the attendee list. I don't know that she was intending to be here as a proxy, but if there are questions for MDT, we can always kick them to Vicky.
Hey, Vicky, are you able to participate in a proxy capacity today?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
And did I already mention Shane?
I am here.
Okay. And Shane, are you now the official planning board designee for this?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, welcome aboard. And last but not least, Debbie Johnston.
Present.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Approval of minutes. We have minutes from January 19th. Are there any additions or corrections or modifications to those minutes? Seeing none, they will stand approved. Is there any public comment on items not on today's agenda? Okay, we'll take silence as concurrence that there is no public comment. So we've got a couple of presentations today, and then under old business, we have just a standing item here that we'll eventually get to when we have time at these meetings, and that is an update on PL funding. But to begin with, Aaron, would you like to kick things off and then bring in Kate to talk about the Highway 200 corridor plan?
Yeah, and Kate was not available to help present today, so I'm going to go through this. But if there are any questions that we need to follow up with, we'll be back next month to adopt this plan, hopefully, and so we can get any of those answered. And not a lot has changed since the last time we presented. So this is kind of a final presentation on the East Missoula Highway 200 corridor plan. So let me share my screen here. All right, can you all see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Well, I will go through just kind of a brief overview of where we're at. We are in the final draft plan stage of this. So approaching the finish line, just about ready to wrap up. My hope is that we can come back with this plan for final adoption by TPCC in March. And so we're in a public comment period right now on this draft plan, taking any last comments, revisions, ideas that we can integrate, but hopefully it's pretty well cooked and we can move along into the implementation once we have it adopted. So let me, just as a kind of a reminder, it it hasn't been that long since we presented, but we have this preferred alternative that we identified back in the fall after looking through a number of different alternatives, doing a lot of public outreach, working with our technical committees to refine down to this preferred design for the corridor. And if you'll remember, we've sort of from the beginning broken this up into 3 distinct elements or 3 distinct portions of the corridor to try to match the design to the adjacent communities and land use. So we have the East Broadway portion that extends from Van Buren to the I-90 interchange. And then from there through East Missoula, we have kind of what we call the East Missoula Main Street section of the project. And then from Staple Street or Brickyard Hill east, we're calling that the east section or the Marshall grade component, which is where we continue the shared use path along Highway 200. So each one of these sections is fairly distinct, but we wanted to integrate each one of those elements into a whole corridor. So it feels like you're traveling through a single corridor and that we're thinking about transitions of those different design elements. A couple of other corridor-wide pieces that we've included are thinking about lighting and how that gets applied throughout the corridor, looking at transit access, making sure we have multimodal connectivity, and thinking about other sort of street-level amenities that we can accommodate within the existing right-of-way. So not a lot has changed since we presented this preferred alternative back in, I think it was October or November. We've made a few minor revisions, and I'll try to go through some of those and just give a quick reminder of each section and what we're proposing. So I'll start with the East Broadway segment. So again, this is from Van Buren to the railroad and I-90. One of the changes we made to this particular section is to better show the changing configuration as the right-of-way shifts. So it varies from around 90 feet of right-of-way closer to Van Buren to it drops down to about 60 feet through sort of the central part of this, and then expands back out to 80 feet as you get closer to the highway interchange. And so we've updated the typical sections to reflect that changing right-of-way and to show how the street will adapt to that. So closer at the Van Buren intersection, I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a minute, but throughout this corridor, we're proposing a shared use path on the south side. And if you'll recall, we were recommending that primarily due to the heavy existing uses on the south side of the road. So you have Missoula College, you have all of the residential. There's not currently a lot on the north side of the street. And so what we see today are a lot of people biking and walking sort of bi-directionally along that section. And so the shared use path was sort of the consensus that we landed on, is that best accommodates the existing travel patterns and prevents people having to cross the street to bike into town and then cross back again if they're going to the university or south of the river. However, the design does still include on-street bike lanes primarily for the existing commuters who might be coming to and from East Missoula, who are comfortable using the roadway. And there is plenty of right-of-way for that. And that can help sort of reduce the pressure on that shared use path for bicycle commuters or potentially recreational cyclists who really just want to get from one place to another as fast as they want to go. There is room for, and we're showing as you get further east and the right-of-way expands back out to 80 feet, some on-street parking on the south side of the road. We see a lot of parking pressure, particularly in the MRL right-of-way across the street. People will park sort of in the grass across the street. And so adding some on-street parking can help with slowing traffic a little bit, but also providing that parking overflow from the multifamily and other residential development.
Aaron, it looks like Jordan has a question.
Yeah.
Thanks. So Aaron, those 2 areas in segment B, the striped pedestrian crossing with the bus stops and lighting improvements, can you describe those? Are those more like, would those essentially just be an ADA compliant crosswalk with a safe place to land for a bus facility on the other side of the street?
Yep, exactly. And so through this section, I guess a couple of pieces there. One, the lighting, we didn't feel the lighting was necessary throughout this entire corridor, just based on the uses and the lack of crossings needed because there's not really any development. We don't anticipate any development on the north side of the road, at least once you get past sort of the Missoula College section. So what we're proposing, we still need those bus stops. So you need to get on and on, bus needs to serve both sides of the street. So putting those crossings at the bus stops to facilitate people getting to and from the other side of the road as they're boarding or alighting the bus. And obviously we'd want to pair the lighting at those locations to increase visibility of people crossing to access those bus stops.
Okay, thanks.
And before you go on, Jordan, excuse me, Aaron, Debbie, you have a question or comment?
I do, Aaron, just on section B, and it appears on section C as well. There's a little bit of probably just remainder width, like 2 feet and 3 feet on the section B, and then 2 feet and unmarked on section C. Is that just unused space within the right of way, or is the 3 foot a sidewalk in section B, like you go from 6 feet to 3 feet?
That wouldn't be sidewalk. Typically, you want at least a foot on either side or a foot and a half adjacent to the sidewalk, just to give room for maintaining those. But you don't always want the sidewalk to go right up to the property line, particularly in this kind of environment. So that's fairly typical, that there's at least a foot of just additional right of way outside of the roadway facilities and the sidewalk. That said, that could become extra space that as we get into designing this roadway, there's always specific challenges that you might run into, or wanting to shift the right of way or add in some additional width somewhere. And so that gives us room to play with as we go into the final, when we start engineering the design of these sections, that we'll have that little bit of width to work with.
Yeah, because there's in section B, there's 10 foot of boulevard, and maybe there's just no sidewalk needed because the commercial runs out and it's unused kind of land. So, okay, gotcha, thanks. And then in section C, that unmarked distance is just unused right of way.
Yep, that's additional right of way. Typically, that would be filled with boulevard or sidewalk, because you want that normally on both sides of the street. But as you get further out on East Broadway, there's just nothing on the north side of the street. And so there's no real reason to put in the full curb, gutter, and sidewalk on that side. And so it's a way to save cost and accommodate, have some additional room to work with, but not need to build out that full section on that side of the street.
Okay, thanks.
Good eye, Debbie. Thanks.
Good questions. All right, so just want to highlight a couple of elements related to this section. One is where East Broadway intersects with Van Buren Street, and we did some additional design work here to improve the safety and try to minimize the number of access points and conflicts through that section, particularly the left turns from eastbound Broadway into those areas of development, and try to simplify some of the movements of the Van Buren Street intersection. We didn't get too far in the design on this because really what we do here has to tie into any designs and analysis of the full Van Buren Street intersection. And so ideally we do a full intersection design there and then make this how our project intersects with that match up. But
Aaron, just a comment, and maybe this would tie in with the broader intersection design work that might happen at some point. But if you're traveling west on Broadway, it's always struck me as a little odd. There's kind of a misalignment of the lanes a little bit as you cross Van Buren and continue on. And I'm surprised that there isn't more kind of mixing of traffic right there inadvertently, because if you were just to take a straight shot across, you would probably end up in the wrong lane.
Right. Yeah, and we tried to do as much as we could to adjust that. It may be that once we get into the engineering of this intersection, that there's more we could do, either through shifting curbs or other design. But what we tried to do is increase, and I think adding this median and removing that left turn lane, the dedicated left turn lane, helps with that alignment a little bit, and just gives some more room for bike lanes and other features here. So
sure. Josh?
Hey, Aaron, thanks, Dave. Aaron, could you explain some of the logic behind the elimination of the left turn lane? Just imagining people coming from East Missoula towards the university by car, and that seems like an important feature, but can you tell me how life goes on without it?
Yeah, and I can get some additional detail from Stephen on the actual traffic analysis, but the idea is that you still retain left turns here. And because of the way that this intersection functions, you would get that dedicated left turn anyways, because all other legs of the intersection are stopped while westbound Broadway is moving. So you don't necessarily need a protected left turn phase because you already have that with the way this intersection functions.
So a green light isn't going to mean eastbound traffic on West Broadway holding up the opportunity for a left turn coming from the westbound folks?
Exactly. So that you would get that essentially when you get the green, you get the protected left turn anyways. And so that, that left turn lane then just becomes sort of vehicle storage. And we think the volumes and having both of these function as through and then that one as a through and left turn lane would be able to accommodate that traffic and sort of simplifies the operation or the space here and allows this median to be put in, which prevents some of those left turn conflicts that are really close to the intersection and just create challenges today. And we heard a lot about the safety concerns and just issues with some of those movements. So this helps sort of create some access management through here, some safety improvements. You get some dedicated left turn lanes into that area, but a little bit further from the intersection and to try to reduce those conflicts or push them out a little bit further from the intersection, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Thanks.
But ultimately, there's a lot of challenges with the Van Buren Street intersection. We know that there are likely some improvements that could be made to the Rux as it crosses, and you have that dedicated right turn lane from the Rattlesnake that creates a conflict with pedestrian crossings, and the through bike movements from the Rattlesnake to the university are sort of that bike lane can be challenging. So there's a lot that could be done to this intersection, and ultimately we want to design all of those things at once. But just some general improvements to this project that would help facilitate the flow of traffic and accommodate some of these improvements that we're suggesting along the East Broadway corridor. All right, so the next big piece to spotlight, and this is perhaps one of the most impactful parts of this project, is improving the access under the railroad bridge into East Missoula. And so we had a lot of conversations, and if you'll remember, we looked at a lot of different potential alternatives, many of them that didn't even make it into our alternatives analysis just because of feasibility or whether MRL would allow. So we looked at things like an at-grade crossing for bikes and pedestrians over the railroad. We looked at tunnels and really landed on the best solution, and the one that's, it's expensive, but it's feasible, is to just replace that bridge and widen it and allow sort of full multimodal connectivity through there. And so that's kind of what this rendering is showing, that it would require a new bridge structure. It's expensive, it'll be challenging, but it would allow us then to have the shared use path continue through there to keep bicyclists and pedestrians separated. It would also have the benefit of increasing visibility for the on and off ramps in between the railroad bridge and I-90. So I guess that's the eastbound I-90 off ramp. As you open up that bridge, you increase the visibility. And then that gets paired with a roundabout at that interchange with I-90 and East Broadway to help accommodate some of those safety issues and to move traffic through there more safely. So that's kind of ultimately opening this up would be eliminating one of the biggest barriers we have today. You can see from that photo that there's really isn't room for anything other than two vehicles moving through there. And so if you're on a bike or walking, you're really walking in the travel lane or biking in the travel lane, and it's a safety issue, and we've known that for a long time. But this really facilitates that connection between the East Broadway portion of the project and East Missoula.
And my only suggestion for the graphic is that there be a passenger train on the rail there. Let's see. Did someone just raise their hand and then put it back down again?
I lowered mine and then raised it again, Dave.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. So Aaron, do you have a sense of how much this bridge would cost?
Yes, we have some preliminary cost estimates, and I've got that sort of included at the end of the presentation. Okay. So we'll get to that in a minute. But yes, we do have cost estimates, and it is one of the more expensive portions of this project, as we all kind of knew it would be.
Thanks.
So then moving into the East Missoula Main Street portion, this design.
Aaron, before
yeah.
you go on, it looks like Jordan has something to say.
So I'm a fan of, I mean, I like that plan a lot. And I guess recognizing that we're cost constrained, do we have like a runner-up idea here, or is there something that is sort of the next best thing if a new bridge is just not feasible?
I don't know. We looked at a lot of different options, including, paths along the base of Mount Jumbo to get people from East Missoula into town. Potentially along the river. I think you may along, kind of through the Easy Street subdivision, there may be some potential there, but none of them are very direct or really serve the same purpose that this would, that is creating that direct, easy to use connection between East Missoula and East Broadway. So I guess, if this becomes a non-starter, then maybe there are alternatives, but none of them were that much cheaper. You might save a little bit of money, and they really don't serve the same purpose that this would. So.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Debbie?
Every time Jordan raises his hand, I'm just going to go right after. Aaron, I guess what I wanted to know is, have you been consulting with MRL on this? Okay, I just want to be sure that they were in the loop and that was moving forward. Thanks.
And that's what, some of our initial ideas of, there were real constraints with doing a tunnel under the railroad. It wasn't that much cheaper than this, and you have to be a certain distance back from this existing structure, and it creates weird angles. And if you'll remember, I think we talked a little bit about it, but there's safety concerns where you have a tunnel with, sort of a 90-degree angle going into it, and there's real safety concerns. People probably wouldn't use it at night or wouldn't feel safe. And it takes you a fair ways out of your way. There's just a lot of challenges with that. So, and a lot of that those ideas and sort of the constraints came from consultation with MRL. So they've been willing to work with us and help at least give us an idea of what's possible and what's not.
Okay.
And the other thing I'll just mention with this, one of the reasons it's so expensive is that we can't interrupt train service while we're doing this. And so you essentially have to create a second temporary bridge that takes trains over while you replace the existing structure. They call it a shoe fly bridge, I think is the official term for it. So essentially you're building two bridges, one being temporary, but that allows us to keep train service going. So those passengers who are going from out of town to east of Missoula can continue through. So the East Missoula section, we focused more on a kind of a Main Street design that includes the raised cycle tracks, boulevards, sidewalks, and portions of this. We're not showing parking on all of it. The right of way is a little constrained, but we think we can mix and match the boulevard with parking where we need it, where those businesses that might lose some of their access and parking and need that. For their customers or employees, we can still provide some on-street parking sort of as needed through the corridor. And we get the two-way center left turn lane, which will help facilitate movements of traffic accessing the residential areas or turning off the corridor, but really creating a much more of a main street with the adequate lighting, potentially putting in some boulevard furniture features and trees, and really improving this section. So this is a rendering of what that could look like. Obviously, there's detail that needs to be worked out in the final engineering design when we get to that. But we know providing the protected bike lanes make them more accessible. They're easier to maintain. They're better year round, and people feel more safe. And then having the sidewalk and lighting and boulevard really increases the accessibility and the safety of pedestrians, and having that lighting will make it feel more like an actual urban street. To accommodate some of the development that we're seeing through East Missoula. Another component of that East Missoula section is really refining the access management. So thinking about how, right now it's kind of a free-for-all. There's no curb, there's no sidewalk, every parking lot is just a wide open space. A lot of the streets aren't defined. And so adding that curb and gutter and sidewalk and those sort of boulevard street features really helps to define where those access points are. And so you get better defined access into both the businesses and those side streets, which we think will will really substantially help with the safety, not just for non-motorized, but vehicular traffic as well. That just it will be more predictable. People will know where everyone is going and coming from, and that will substantially improve the safety and the flow of traffic through this corridor.
Debbie?
I might have been reading in too much to the last photo, but does it include utility relocates to go from overhead to underground power?
That's a good question. I think we could. That might be a decision that happens at the point where we're engineering the project, but it seems like that's happening more and more as we do street projects, and there's an opportunity to relocate utilities that we'll do that where we can. I think it's generally a good idea for urban and, not having power lines running through an urban streetscape just makes it seem a lot nicer.
Okay.
I can't tell you how much I love this schematic. It is such the wild west of asphalt out there right now. So,
yeah, and this substantially improves that. Both for the streets and for the businesses. But again, some of these locations, it's likely that, well, we know a lot of the off-street parking for some of these businesses are extend into the right of way, and so there will be a loss of parking, and we'll want to be make sure that we balance that with on-street parking where it's needed. And you can even see that kind of in the westernmost portion of this, where the boulevard is dropped in favor of on-street parking through there. Or, we have some right of way to work with, but I think being conscious of that and providing some on-street parking through here would be a benefit.
Debbie, did you have a follow-up, or is your hand just okay? Very good. Go ahead, Aaron.
So then the last piece through here is the issue of these angled intersections, and we heard a lot, especially from East Missoula residents, that is a concern of theirs, and the more we can do to improve that. And so there are a couple of options we looked at. There's sort of the existing intersection configuration where the streets come off at an angle that really just either you're making too sharp of a turn and you have to slow way down, and there's potentially some rear end crashes associated with that, or you're hitting it at such an angle that you can turn off of Highway 200 onto that side street at 50 miles an hour and it feels comfortable. So there's a couple of options. One is to fully square those up to a 90-degree angle. But what happens there, in part because of the constrained right-of-ways, is that you get offset intersections, which isn't necessarily the safest design. Or kind of what we're recommending is you do a little bit of squaring up and some creative sort of relocating the street within the right-of-way. So maybe you're not going to a full 90-degree, but you're much closer, and you can design your curb radii to accommodate a normal turning vehicle movement, but you maintain that sort of intersection where the streets are across from each other. You're not creating an offset geometry. So that's our recommendation, and obviously there's a lot of details that would have to be worked out as we engineer and design those, but generally speaking, that's the recommendation, is wherever possible to square those up within the existing right-of-way and make them more of a standard 90-degree intersection. So that leaves us to the last section, Sharon, Marshall. So from Brickyard Hill, and this is where we transition to a shared use path. This is a more kind of rural suburban section of the roadway. Full curb and gutter didn't seem warranted or reasonable, and so we are showing a shared use path along the side of the highway. This plan contemplates it on the north side of Highway 200, which is sort of a change from what has been looked at in the past in terms of having a trail on the south side or adjacent to the river. And that's in part due to basically all of the residential through this section is on the north side of the highway. And so you allow better access to those people to the trail without having to cross Highway 200. But it also creates some better opportunity or maybe easier to get through the constrained portion on Old Marshall grade. It'll still likely be, a little bit more expensive and may require some retaining walls, but there's just more room to work with in that section than there is between the road and the river. Even after MDT's replacement or sort of bank stabilization project, I think it would only allow for at most 6 feet through that really constrained section between the roadway and the river, which is really not enough for a shared use path. So this helps facilitate that. And again, if everyone is living on the north side of the road, that allows them to access the trail much easier than having to cross Highway 200 sort of at every location, which may not be as safe. And then here again, we have bus stops paired with pedestrian crossings. So on the east end, the bus stop is paired with where the trail crosses to the south side to connect up with the existing trail on Tamarack, and same on the west end, more in the East Missoula section. As it transitions from protected bike lanes to a shared use path, you would have that crossing paired with a bus stop to sort of maximize your or to sort of put all of your pedestrian crossings in one location, or more of your pedestrian use in one location. And then having something like an RRFB to help facilitate that level of pedestrian activity. So any questions on the designs before I move into kind of the final recommendations?
Jordan?
Has there been outreach with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on transit access at Sharon?
Yeah, so sorry, I wasn't sure if we had that graphic in here still. So part of this element is looking at the parking and river access at Sharon. And so this is actually the part of the plan that may be moving quickest in this, that there's been a lot of work on that potential parking access. MDT and FWP have been working on looking at their easements and the right-of-way in that section. If you'll recall, one of our recommendations, and in fact our preferred recommendation, is to add that additional parking space just down the road from Sharon for sort of the overflow or most of the parking. I think it's looking reasonably good, but in any case, MDT and FWP have been working actively on that particular location. And then it's just a matter of what happens with the actual fishing access. But our design is showing a bus stop at Sharon so that you could facilitate bus, whether it's a shuttle or mountain line, pick up and drop off at that.
Great. I think that's really important. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions at Mountain Line and with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the university about recreational shuttles. And there's also House Bill 306 that would essentially deregulate recreational shuttles and make it so that recreational shuttle providers would not have to go through the PSC approval process. So I think it's really likely that we could see some proliferation of private recreation shuttles that are a little bit less regulated than previous iterations. So yeah, I'm glad to see it in there, and I just would encourage it to be robust and adequate for future use.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah. Let's go to Josh and then John Wolverton. Josh, who's our resident county commission expert on this particular recreation area.
Yeah, as my kids have pointed out, Dave, they say, why did you get so interested in parking? So, Aaron, all I was going to add to this, and you did a good job of summarizing it, is that along with FWP and, God, what was the other entity?
MDT.
And MDT is MCO. That's Missoula County. We are actively involved in this, and our staff are part of those negotiations. And it really is indeed moving quickly, and we could have a solution in the near term.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting, and that's a huge safety component of this, trying to get cars off of Highway 200 through this corridor.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it because of the safety. It's all about, in my mind, it's all about safety. Before some terrible thing happens, we get this fixed.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, to say that during the summer that's a cluster in there would be a huge understatement. John Wolverton with an asterisk next to your name. John, are you out there?
There we go. I didn't have a mute function button here. And also I can't even see my own video, but so Aaron, can you hear me?
Yep. I can.
So my question goes back to the more eastern segments, a cross section, and I'm sorry if I missed this, but you'd mentioned raised cycle tracks along this, and I wanted to put out there that this is in reference to the part of Russell Street that's completed, and although that's a great improvement compared to what was existing, they're not adequate for this sort of 8-year-old to 80-year-old set, and I would suggest that they need to be far more segregated than what we see on Russell near the bridge. with a real bona fide curb, and even better than that, be segregated, with furniture from the car travel laneways. Could you talk a little more about that detail if you're into that level of detail and design yet?
Aaron, do you want to speak to any of that?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing I'll say is that we're learning a lot kind of as we go on best practices and how to design these facilities. And yeah, no, I agree. Generally, the more separation and protection we have for the bike lanes, the better. One of the designs we're working on for the Mullen Build project is having the bike lane separated, sort of adjacent to the sidewalk and separated from the road by a boulevard. And so that's one way where, you then have a location for snow storage from the road and from the bike lane. And you don't get sort of the road snow plowed up onto the bike lane. So that's one option through here. I think we have some flexibility as we start to do the engineering design, but ultimately we wanted to make sure we had a protected bike lane. And it may change, it may be that there are developments that come through that really want kind of a more downtown feel, and they want, a wide sidewalk, and we could potentially accommodate that. You wouldn't want the bike lane to sort of run right through the middle of that. And so I think we'll just have to, we've got the concept here. We know we want to do a protected bike lane. When we get to the actual engineering design, we'll want to take all of those specific elements into consideration. So I think it's a good point, and something that we're working hard on a lot of different projects to try to figure out the best way to provide that level of protection and comfort.
So you're talking protected bikeway, not just a raised cycle track, which like say does work on North Higgins because there's parallel parking and slow motor vehicles. But on a road like this, I don't see something like the Russell Street segment, the new segment, really working very well for creating comfort for cyclists, or say a parent pulling their kid in a bike trailer.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Okay, Shane.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and maybe I just missed this, Aaron. Where was the transition from the shared use path going from the south to the north? Has that been defined yet, or is it just is it at the hill?
Yeah, so I took those diagrams up. They are in the report. We do have a diagram of those transitions. One will happen, I think it's at, it's not showing here. It's essentially at Staples Street. And so the transition would be from the two-way cycle track to shared use path on the north side of the road. And so the path would start on the north side, sort of at the East Missoula, and then continue down the hill on the north side of Highway 200. And what we've proposed to do is that would be paired with a transit stop. So you have your transit stop, you have your cycle track, or your bike ped crossing, all in one location to try to sort of concentrate the visibility. And you compare that with something like an RRFB to help sort of increase the safety of people passing or crossing the street, and just awareness of motorists that is a heavy use crossing location. And we do the same thing on the west end of the corridor. So as you come through the I-90 interchange into East Missoula, there's another crossing where it splits from the shared use path on the south side of the road to the protected bike lanes going through East Missoula. And again, you pair that with a transit stop, you're focusing your pedestrian use and visibility. Does that make sense, Shane?
Yeah, totally.
Thanks, Shane.
All right. So then moving into kind of the last part of our plan that we've been working on over the last couple of months is thinking about the funding and implementation. And this is perhaps the more challenging part of this project, that the design is in some ways the easiest step. But now we have a design, we have a good idea of what we want to build, and some much better cost estimates. So the next step is really identifying what our funding sources are, looking at specific projects within this, knowing that we're unlikely to be able to build the whole corridor all at once, that just the cost of that is likely going to exceed any potential funding source that we have. And so the funding and implementation is really focused mostly on how do we get this project funded and sort of move it along into construction, and what are the different ways that we can do that? What different funding sources? How do we break this project up? what funding can we bring to each one of those discrete elements. And so it's a way to try to get us started moving in that direction. So one of the things we've added since the last time you've seen this draft plan is essentially discrete projects that could be focused on in terms of implementing this. Again, we could do this in a number of different ways depending on how much funding, but I think it's helpful to know sort of what each discrete element costs and what funding sources might be available and how we might approach sort of chipping away at those one at a time as we're waiting for maybe a larger funding source. So you'll see that this table kind of breaks each project element down by what the project is, what's included, looking at some feasibility considerations because we want to anticipate any challenging design elements that we might run across. So for example, the East Missoula streetscape reconstruction, you've got a lot of property owners. We need to think about transit stops and how you're designing those and where they go, and then potential traffic studies that are needed to show that we can effectively put transit onto Highway 200. And then thinking about what are the goals of each of those projects, and then trying to think about what priority each one of these projects or where they fall in terms of relative priority. This page is showing all of these being high. I think the whole corridor ideally would be high priority, but really thinking that the East Missoula streetscape reconstruction, that's a really high priority, both from a redevelopment perspective, safety, just creating more of a main street for that community. Another high priority is the Montana Rail Link bridge replacement. And so this gets at that question of what that cost is. We think the estimated cost to replace the bridge is about 10.8 million. Obviously that goes up every year it takes us to construct this. All of these costs are in today's dollars, so we can expect them to increase the longer it takes. So that's how this implementation is broken down. And then the potential funding sources are just sort of our initial look at what funding do we know is out there, and how could that be leveraged to help construct, whether it's a local match or fully funding each one of these sections. So just give us an idea of where to look for funding, how to think about starting to prioritize each one of these elements.
Thanks, Aaron. David Gray, did you have a comment or question?
No, I just want to know how this fits in with the recommended projects with the long range plan. And I see that the priorities are high on this implementation. But how does that fit in with what we're doing right now with the long range plan?
This is an excellent question. Aaron?
Yeah, well, ultimately all of our projects are going to be high priority, I think is what we're going to do. No, the priority here is on each of these elements within this project. So it's not about the priority of this project in relation to all the other projects in the long range plan. We'll have a presentation that Jennifer is here for in just a minute to talk about sort of where we're landing in our long range plan prioritization process. But within the context of this corridor and how we might prioritize tackling individual elements, that's where this priority. So the East Missoula streetscape, for instance, would be a high priority. Just go to the next slide. In comparison, something like the East Broadway reconstruction, where we already have bike lanes and sidewalk, is a relatively low priority portion of this project. So it's not really a priority of this project versus other things we could do in the region. It's more of how we start to tackle each element of this project in terms of its relative priority to other elements of the project. Does that make sense to everyone? Or is that clear? So it allows us to start chipping away at this in a way that is more strategic and not trying to do all of them at the same time, because there's just a lot of funding to get that done. And I don't know that there's a single funding source that would allow us to do that all in one go.
Aaron, just one comment. Do you know, I see a notation here on the Sharonda Tamarack shared use path potential funding sources being FLAP, and that seems like a long shot to use federal land access program dollars for. It's certainly not likely to be a project that we countywide prioritize. I don't even know how to make the case that that would be a priority. Do you have any insight?
You mean the Highway 200 Sharon to Tamarack Trail?
Yeah, the Federal Land Access Program is typically used for accessing federal lands, and
yeah, it is a bit of a long shot, I think, but it does. You have Marshall Canyon accesses federal lands, and so you're getting people to Marshall, and then from there,
yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're probably right that that's a much longer shot than something like TA or some other funding source.
Well, what the heck? Doesn't hurt to have it on the list. Mirta?
Just quick question about the potential funding sources for the places where you have build. Is that for the next round of build grants that might be available, or just any federal grant, whatever they call it, whenever that becomes available? Could you speak a little bit about what that potential looks like?
Yeah, I mean, there will be another round of build. We know that the announcement is likely to come by sometime in April. I think the legislation or the FAST Act or the continuing of the FAST Act requires that build be opened up by, I think, end of April. And so what we're seeing from FHWA is that they're working on a new application or notice, and that we should expect those sometime before the end of April. Whether this project is ready for a build application is another question, and there may be some other competing projects, but I think build could maybe just be a shorthand for any sort of federal funding of the nature of build or stimulus, infrastructure fund, anything that we could compete for this specific project. We're in a much better spot now than we were, say a year ago, when we didn't really even know what the concept was. So it's moving us forward, and I think that the next step is trying to get sort of further along into engineering design so that we can be competitive for those grants.
And just very quickly, remind me what the local match is for build. Is it 20%?
Oh, that's a good question. In the last round, I believe all of Missoula is considered rural, and there is no required match for rural. But that said, I don't know that I've ever seen a build grant funded 100%. So a good example is the Mullen Build project that we received. I think we asked for something like 40 or 50% of the project, which was, I believe, 26 million. Maybe it was closer to 60% of the project, and we received 13 million. So it's very unlikely that you get 100% out of build.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Mirta. Jordan?
Yeah, along those lines, I was going to ask, if there is an infrastructure package in the future, and hypothetically $10 million falls off a truck, and we're able to put it to use, what would sort of be the timeline of this being, shovel ready enough to be competitive in a grant process?
That's a good question. I think there is some, and I'm by no means an expert at this, but it seems like getting to more or less the 30% design is really helpful, where you've done a survey, you know what your right of way is, you have sort of at least a preliminary idea of what your typical sections and how your plan is going to fit within that right of way. That is a good place to be for applying for those kinds of grants. And then from there, you've got, you obviously go into quickly doing the final engineering and design and going to construction. But I don't know that you necessarily have to be there for these projects, but it is helpful to know, what are your right of way constraints and some of these other potential impacts. You don't want to apply for and get money and then realize 6 months or a year down the road that you have missed something, or that your costs are going to go up and you're on the hook for covering that, and having to then scramble to find those additional funds.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would sure like to be ready for 10.8 million rolling off of a train car. So I want to leave enough time for the long-range transportation plan discussion. So any final thoughts from anyone on this? And Aaron, you were a crowd pleaser today. This was a great discussion.
Yeah, well, thanks for the input. I think it's all really helpful.
Okay, next steps.
Yep. So we do have our public comment is closing at the end of the month. So any final comments that we received, we've had a few trickle in, nothing really substantive. Some related to transit that we passed along to Mountain Line. But our goal is to bring this back in March for adoption. So I think we can have potentially less discussion unless there are other thoughts that folks have. But I'm hoping that we're at the point now, or at the end of this public last review, that we'll have a plan that we're all happy and comfortable with. And then from there, I think the next step is getting the city and the county to adopt this as a plan, or to, buy in some fashion to this design. And then from there, it's on to trying to figure out how we get to the next steps for implementation.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm thrilled to see this plan come together. It's been long overdue. All right. Well, without any final burning questions, let's go ahead and move on to a presentation on the draft long-range transportation plan. Recommended scenario, funding outlook, and initial programmatic recommendations. And I'll turn it back to you, Aaron, and Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. Well, while Jennifer's getting joined and set up, Jennifer, I'm assuming you'll be able to share your screen if you want to take over PowerPoint duties. Long range plan is another one that we're sort of approaching the final stretch. We still have some work to do, but things are starting to come together. And so this presentation is really an overview of how we're taking what we're starting to work on in terms of taking our scenario evaluation and the public outreach we did at the end of last year, and how we're starting to bring it all together and think about what's going to go into the recommended plan, as far as our project list, but also thinking about our programs and other types of recommendations that come out of the long range plan. So as I mentioned today, we've got a draft recommended scenario that we want to present and get some initial feedback on. We are working on updating our revenue projections. And so I want to give a quick overview of where we're at with that. And then talk some about the sample projects programs and then where we're going to go from here in order to get this plan adopted by the late spring. So Jennifer, do you want to take over?
Sure. Although you really are on such a crowd-pleasing role, I don't want to interrupt that. So we won't give you too much of a break here, Aaron. But good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you all again. And happy to be back at this point to share a little bit of what we heard through our outreach in December and January, and how we've used all of that to shape our draft recommended scenario. So I'll start us off today with just a quick reminder of the process that we've been going through over the last couple of months. For those of you who have been really anxious to get to the end of this beautiful flow chart, there is good news. We are almost there. So over the course of the summer and fall, we collected project and program ideas from all of you, from our various committees, and from the public, and used our evaluation framework to score all of those and develop them into scenarios. And I think the last time we were together, we talked a little bit about what those scenarios were, and then used the input that we have received from all of you and from the public to develop a draft recommended scenario. So we're going to be working with our committees over the next couple of weeks to refine that recommended scenario. We'll take it out to the public for another look, and then we will be at the point of actually prioritizing this smaller list of projects. But we are very close to the end of the process related to the project identification. So just as a quick reminder, when we did talk last, we had 3 different transportation scenarios that we were reviewing with the public. And those were coupled with 2 different growth scenarios. One growth scenario focused on business as usual, which just maintains the region's current approach to growth. And the other was a little bit more inward focused, and we called that one strategic growth. And the intent was really to see whether one of those 2 growth scenarios would have different impacts across the 3 transportation scenarios. The 3 transportation scenarios focused on new connections. So that was a lot of new infrastructure, a lot of bigger projects, complete streets, active transportation, bridges, and new trails. The enhanced connections scenario focused on completing the networks that already exist and really making the best use of some of the current connections and some of the current investments the region is making. A lot of greenways and active transportation projects. And then regional equity focused in on some of our highest scoring projects around our equity metrics and also really connecting some of the neighborhoods and some of the parts of the region and the broader county, of course, that have been a little bit less invested in over time. So putting a fine point on affordability, on access and opportunity as part of that scenario. When we evaluated those scenarios, we used over 15 different metrics that are tied to our 5 goals for Missoula Connect. And you might remember that all 3 of the scenarios had strong performance in different ways. They all move the region toward the different goals that we have set out, but again, do it in slightly different ways. So new connections was really strong on helping to connect some of our key commercial corridors, also some opportunity to really think about expanding freight and multimodal access. Enhanced connections was particularly strong on walking and biking access and had pretty significant safety benefits. And then regional equity, as you might imagine from the name, was really focused on new options for people, affordability, and really creating access to opportunity. So all 3 of the scenarios do good things or perform well against the goals. And then when we added the strategic growth scenario on, we saw that each of those 3 transportation scenarios did even a little bit better. So we took that input out to the public. We hosted a series of online open houses in December. We attended community council meetings as well, engaged directly with stakeholders, and then we also had an online survey. So that period of outreach is, of course, complemented by what we've done throughout the entire long-range transportation plan, going back a little over a year. It's also informed by work that the MPO did before we started this project with the Regional Transportation Survey. So we've been using that information as we've gone, but wanted to share just a couple of highlights from what we heard specifically related to scenarios. So we asked folks to tell us, of those 3 transportation scenarios, which best meets your daily needs. And across that question, but also across a lot of other discussion that we had with folks and several other survey questions, we heard a pretty strong preference for enhanced connections and regional equity. There were also a lot of folks who were really interested in a mix of the 3 scenarios, feeling like there were specific projects in new connections that were really important. So that was good feedback, really helpful feedback. And then also there were a lot of specific ideas around particular types of projects and specific projects that people wanted to move forward. Lots of support for complete streets, and then a lot of support for some of the key trails and greenway projects as well. So we took all of that input and we did a handful of different things to create our recommended scenario. And I'm just going to walk us through these bullets to make sure that the process we used is really transparent for folks. And then we'll take a look at some of the projects that both are and aren't included in the current draft scenario. So with the feedback from people that enhanced connections and regional equity were the 2 scenarios that were really rising to the top for them, we started developing our recommended scenario by including all of the projects that were in both of those scenarios. And you might remember that there was some overlap between those 2. And so we felt like that was a great set of projects to start with. We then went through all of the specific feedback on the types of projects that were most important to people, and then specific projects that people really wanted to see. Some of those came from, for example, MRA, others came from our committees, others came from individuals, but projects that just have come up over and over as critically important. So we added those to the recommended scenario. Then we looked back at the equity weighting that we did, and we identified projects that scored well on the equity weighting, and that enabled us to bring in some of those really important projects from other scenarios. And so we brought in a few projects from New Connections, and then also some of the projects that were in either Enhanced Connections or Regional Equity. And so that step was the way that we felt really made sense to try and create that blended scenario, that little bit of mix and match that many of you have asked about as we've gone through this process. We were working, of course, with a fiscal constraint. Our limit is at about $181 million. And that is beyond the projects that are committed. So we have a handful of projects that were in all of the scenarios and are included in the recommended project list as well. So we had to do a little bit of balancing. We did have to put some projects on the illustrative list, but we tried to do that balancing by thinking about whether there were parallel facilities that were being created or whether there was a higher scoring or a more important connection that could be included on the recommended list. So that's the process that we went through in a nutshell. In your packet for today's meeting, you've got the full list of projects that are included on the recommended scenario, both corridor projects and intersection projects. And then also you have the list of illustrative projects. I believe you also have a static map, and then we've created an interactive map, very similar to what we used during the scenario process, to just give you the opportunity to dig in a little bit more to those two lists. So again, with the recommended scenario, we did really focus on the neighborhood and the regional connections, trying to support inward growth, recognizing that the strategic growth scenario really did a lot more when we looked at our evaluation of the scenarios. We wanted to make sure that we were connecting to some of the key investments the region is already making. The Mullen area, of course, is one of those. And then wanted to incorporate some of the very important complete streets connections, like Howard Razor Drive, like Russell Street, the project that Aaron was just speaking with you all about, East Broadway and Highway 200 as well. There are plenty of projects that aren't included within that $181 million cap, though. And so a few of those that I will highlight that are currently on the illustrative list are some of the really big ones that were part of the New Connections scenario. The biggest of those is the Russell Street to I-90 extension. There is a portion of the River Road Complete Street that is not included as well. And then the fairly expensive Riverfront Triangle non-motorized bridge. So those are just a few. Part of the reason that I want to mention those is, again, because the recommended scenario is just a draft right now. As we're going through discussions with our committees, with the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee a couple of weeks ago, we want to be clear that there is flexibility to move projects between the recommended and illustrative lists. What is really important, though, is that we've got everything captured between one of those two lists. Because as you know from past long-range plans, there are times when an opportunity presents itself and you want to be able to grab a project from the illustrative list and move it forward with maybe a funding source that you hadn't anticipated. So we did bring forward all of the projects that had been in scenarios that were previously on the illustrative list, and do want to stress that this is an important opportunity to make sure that we've got the right projects included in the recommended scenario. So for discussion today, Aaron and I teed up a couple of key questions to just focus in on some of the areas where there really are trade-offs that we needed to make in thinking about what was and wasn't included. So Aaron, I'll turn it over to you to talk through these.
Yeah, thanks. So the first one that we wanted to focus on is this area, North Reserve and Scott Street, an area where we are seeing more and more activity. Even just last week, there was an announcement from the city about some more additional affordable housing development. We're seeing a lot of growth and redevelopment happening in that area. And it's also an area where we had to make some trade-offs. As Jennifer mentioned, the Russell to I-90 connection project did not make it into the recommended project list, in part due to the cost of that project, that it's a really expensive one to complete. And not to say that it won't happen or that there could be an opportunity that allows us to do that, but in place of that, we tried to look at alternative ways to create the connectivity in this area that we are going to need to accommodate that future growth. And so one of those is doing the Howard Razor Drive connection from North Reserve to Scott Street. There's the I-90 trail connecting up Grant Creek and the trails there, and North Reserve to the north side. We also have some connectivity in terms of protected bike lanes and other facilities connecting the new investments in the build grant to the greater part, sort of east into the core of Missoula. So I think one of the questions here are, we're trying to accommodate future growth in this area. It's rapidly changing. We made some decisions about sort of what's included and what's not. And I think we had some really good discussion about this at TTAC, just in terms of what's going on here and what our investments that might need to be. But, one of the questions are, do these seem like the right connections to make? Are we missing something critical in this area? Sort of as a example area, we've been making these decisions sort of throughout, but this is an area of rapid growth. And we wanted to make sure we have those right. So
David Gray, you have your hand up.
I do, and thank you. So this particular area with the connection to I-90 is super complicated with MDT and how we would actually connect to I-90, and it's also URD, right? And I think we need to make some decisions as the MPO on what decisions we can make, because the on-ramps, off-ramps, all of these things, yes, we can go for them, and it would probably be beneficial, but it would be super expensive.
So David, did you have some additional thoughts as far as our decision space on this and what would be most helpful at this juncture?
No, not really. Aside from the URD making a better descriptive element on what's going on out there, and for the MPO and TPCC to apply federal funding, I think at this point it's going to be complicated.
Yes, no doubt about that. Jordan, thanks, David.
I support not including this as a project in the active list, or forgive me if my terminology is wrong, but having this as an illustrative project. I think it's a concept that's come up a lot that is important to have as an illustrative concept, but I think, the I-90 trail tying in with the Grant Creek Trail, and all of the development up in this area, the Scott Street area, complete streets with the city's recent housing announcement, and the Public Works Facility Master Plan is going to be critical, and most likely eminently fundable in some way or another. Same with that Howard Razor Street. I mean, creating alternatives to the Cemetery Drive, industrial, kind of semi-hazardous path of travel especially for non-motorized. So I think these are all good, and I think the I-90 connection to me falls, as far as, I mean, we just had a presentation on the Highway 200, multiple tens of millions of dollars to complete that project, and this is going to be similar. And I think if we stack up all of those big projects, this one doesn't make the cut to me, the I-90 Russell connection.
Thanks, Jordan. And just by way of order of magnitude, I'm guessing 50, 100 million.
50, 100 million sounds like the exact number.
Okay, 50 to 100 million. Yes. Mierta.
I wanted to support what Jordan just mentioned regarding that connection. It's been brought up for decades. And I think that every time we look at that as even a possibility, we quickly realize it's unattainable. And I think that given all the development and all the intentional development that we are seeing in the west side and north side neighborhoods, I am not sure that this would provide any benefit to the neighborhood. In fact, I think that there could be some serious unintended consequences to the fabric of those neighborhoods and the very thing that we're trying to create. And so I too think that it's best to not continue to resuscitate this project. We've killed it successfully in other LRTP updates, and I think it should just not be brought up again. I think that there are other projects that we continue to bring up that could have a much more significant benefit to the neighborhood, particularly those that are non-motorized. I think that that's something that I can completely see a benefit of them being a benefit to the neighborhoods that are growing in this area.
Thanks, Mirta. Don, and then back to David Gray.
Aaron and Jennifer, maybe a question about this. What the projects that are on your list, 6, 7, 33 there, are all fairly low cost, I'm thinking. And I guess I wondered what other projects. I'm in agreement with the previous comments about not trying to raise the Russell Street interchange to the top level. But I do wonder whether there needs to be some more investment in the transportation, vehicular transportation infrastructure within that study area. There's a lot of areas out there that are pretty underserved by roads. And I think we're starting to develop into them in a pretty substantive ways. And I guess I wondered what other projects you looked at that might sort of address the not connection to the freeway system, but connection to our overall transportation Missoula neighborhood system.
Aaron or Jennifer?
Sure. Aaron, I'll start and then please feel free to jump in. So just to go back to a couple of the comments, Dave, what you were remembering and what you threw out in terms of a cost for that Russell Street to I-90 extension was right on. We costed it at 70 million to start. And so out of 181 that is available, that was going to be a huge chunk of the funding. And so as you all are thinking through these trade-offs and what we can do if we don't do that, I think you are flagging a lot of the really important possibilities. Don, to your question, there are probably 6 or 7 other projects that are on the illustrative list, and I'm looking at our interactive map here that could help to fill some of the additional mobility gaps in this area, and then even heading a little bit further out. And I won't run through all of them, but just one example is the Old Grant Creek Cemetery Road, Rogers Street multimodal improvements. And so that would sort of be this connection that I'm drawing here. So that's another one that could be included. I can find the costs for that one as well. There are a few other potential improvements as we head further out this direction. So heading further out Grant Creek Road. So there are others that are on the illustrative list that we could potentially add in if this area feels like it does need some more complete streets type investment.
And possibly what I'm identifying is a lack of railroad crossings. And maybe I guess I was wondering if that's probably really expensive too. But I am, I look at that whole area and I think it's sort of landlocked, isolated. And I wish for it to be connected more to the south through the rail corridor. And so that's, I guess, maybe really what I was getting toward.
Got it. Great. The England Boulevard extension, Aaron, right, is probably the only other one that we have on the illustrative list that might meet that need.
Yeah, I think we had two potential alternatives for a railroad crossing, although I will say that in that sort of Russell Street to I-90 connection, the bridge across the railroad is the bulk, I imagine would be the bulk of that cost. We've also just explored the opportunity of potentially doing and putting in the I-90 interchange, but not connecting across the railroad tracks to provide that additional sort of just vehicular capacity in and out of the area, and also to sort of have an alternate route for trucks to get them off of Scott Street and out of the neighborhoods to some degree. There's some real benefit to that. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is that there are a number of areas in here that are going to warrant a lot closer look at our infrastructure, both transportation and utility infrastructure, and to do some real, I think we're looking more or less big picture in this plan, but we're going to have to, and there's, I think the city is going to move forward with some very strategic master planning, both around that Scott Street area with the city-owned properties, the affordable housing that's coming online. And I think we need to figure out how people are going to get in and out of that neighborhood as we increase the development. We have Bellagio coming on board. We have this new city parcel that's being developed. There's just going to be a lot of activity here, and we have 2 or 3 ways across the railroad tracks that are all probably not as sufficient as we would want them to be. So I think we do need to do some really focused planning work around that area, those areas in the neighborhoods, and figure out how that growth is going to be accommodated. And I don't know that we have all of the answers right now, but I think we're going to have to start coming up with them as this development happens.
Thanks. And just so we can manage our time here, was there another specific point beyond this that you were, or another scenario or you were wanting some specific input on? And we don't have to leave this quite yet. There are a couple other questions here, but I'm seeing a head nod. Yes.
Dave. Yeah, sorry. There was one other we were going to tee up for some discussion.
Yeah, let's reserve a little bit of time for that. But first I have David Gray and then Debbie. And thanks, Don, for your comments there.
Am I up?
Yep.
Yes, you are.
You're muted if you're talking, Dave.
Sorry. MRA needs to bring their money to bear on this end, and it's a tough one. Then we've talked about connections to I-90, everything, DirecTV, and all of like a bunch of stuff within this particular area, and it really needs to solidify itself instead of it being a federally funded thing. And that's tough, So what do we do with a URD, and how do we deal with this particular area, which is basically a brown field, right? And then we've got a green field over on the other side of the street, and it's tough. So, yeah, I don't know what to say. I guess 20 years of experience and not understanding just exactly how this thing is all coming about. It's interesting, but MRA needs to deal with the North Reserve Scott Street, and then the city and the county need to deal with Missoula or Mullen area. Thanks.
Thank you. Debbie?
Jennifer or Aaron, just a quick question on the process. I wanted to know how many individual commenters or participants there were in the December, January, February public outreach. Do you have just an approximate number of?
Yeah, sure. I think through our online survey, we had about 50 respondents. And then over the course of the different meetings that we hosted, the meetings that the MPO hosted specifically, attendance varied from a handful of folks, like 4 to 5 folks, up to about 20 some at our largest meeting. And then a few of the community council meetings we attended had, in the neighborhood of 20 to 30, I think. So it's, it's a tough time to do outreach. Certainly outreach during COVID continues to be challenging. And that's part of the reason that we did go back through all the feedback that we've received over the course of the project, back to the regional survey as well, so that we were really broadening what we were considering to be input on this piece.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Why don't we, Aaron and Jennifer, move on to the next piece that you'd like input
Sure.
on?
Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, and this one, maybe we spend time on this, or maybe it's just something to chew on and provide us some individual feedback. But we wanted to look regionally too at some of these trade-offs, particularly related to the major commuter trail networks. So like the Milwaukee, sort of connecting from east to west, and tried to make some trade-offs in those connections. And we really focused on that major east to west corridor, sort of the most feasible, easily implementable connection, essentially from the Y in Frenchtown out to past Bonner. And so you'll notice the recommended projects are primarily following Mullen Road, where we know we have there is right of way there potentially, that you don't have the same constraints maybe that you do on the Milwaukee sort of along the rail grade, that we don't have. That railroad grade is not necessarily available that full length. And so while we want to see that connection happen as part of the sort of the rails to trails and the full east to west connection nationally, we think the Mullen Road sort of builds on existing trail connections and gets us there in a way that's really feasible. We also made some trade-offs kind of on the riverfront trail network, again, looking at feasibility and providing the key corridors. So really focusing on Ron's River Trail, making that connection essentially from Madison to west of Orange Street, or connecting at Madison to Russell Street. So filling in the gaps. A lot of those projects are sort of in process, being planned, but really refining that, strengthening that connection. And then looked at some trail connections across the river. So Jennifer mentioned that we are not currently including the Riverfront Triangle non-motorized bridge, but we are showing a bridge along the railroad, the existing railroad bridge. So continuing the Bitterroot Trail north across the river. Just again, there's still some questions there, but if we can get access to that railroad bridge and either build off of it or work something out with MRL, that becomes a much more feasible cost-wise and provides a similar connection. We had some really good conversations at some of our other committee meetings about, what's the appropriate spacing of non-motorized bridge connections across the river. But something we were thinking about, again, looking at feasibility, cost, and weighing those trade-offs and trying to make those key connections where we think they're going to be really impactful. And then sort of east of town, there are a number of shared use paths that we're showing. Our recommendations are focused primarily on the Highway 200 corridor, completing that project, and then making some key neighborhood connections in the West Riverside neighborhood, where we know we heard a lot from those communities that they need those non-motorized connections to the existing trail, or just sort of from those neighborhoods as Highway 200 continues to get busier, or just try to improve connections for those communities as well. So again, a lot of this is thinking about that regional sort of rural to urban connections that we wanted to show some of those regional connections in the plan. And that was one of the ways that we got to it.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I think this is super important. And part of the broader context is Missoula County is looking at doing some transportation planning. We have not yet to date in our history formalized any sort of transportation plan countywide beyond the MPO boundaries here. So making sure that our planning efforts align is pretty important. And I think the non-motorized piece is also critical. I'm a bit partial to the Mullen Road shared use path concept. And I think that's going to be a key component, particularly as we look at our land use planning in the build area. Just for point of clarification, Aaron, when you mentioned the MRL bridge, are you talking the one right in the middle of town here for the Bitterroot branch?
Yeah.
And were you contemplating not retiring it as a railroad bridge, or are you thinking about cantilevering some sort of a pedestrian trail off the side of that thing?
Well, yeah, I don't know that I have we have specific in mind with that, but it's an opportunity with that rail corridor, depending on what MRL is willing to do with it. And anything we do is going to have to get MRL buy-in.
Sure. And I would strongly advocate for not turning that into a rail to trail sort of project, because although it might not make sense in the near term to use that rail corridor for rail, I think history has shown, whether it's the Milwaukee road or other examples, once the rail option is gone, it's gone forever.
Right.
But maybe there's a creative way to compatibly accomplish both goals, keeping options open in the future while addressing current bike ped needs. Jordan?
Yeah, my impression is that MRA had previously had plans to do exactly that, Dave, to cantilever some kind of a bike ped facility off of that bridge. And I think everything was fine, but MRL might, and I don't want to speak too certainly here because I wasn't around when this happened, but MRL was not willing or able to provide a long-term lease or long-term assurances that that facility would remain in operation. So I think it's probably worth having the conversation again and keeping the project on the project list.
Yeah, I would agree.
And again, I think some of these trade-offs will be, which opportunity presents itself first. So we're showing these projects as recommended, but it may be that a development comes through for Riverfront Triangle, something, that there is an opportunity, and then that becomes sort of the priority because of that opportunity. But I think the key is to show that we need a connection in there somewhere, whichever of those it is. And currently the railroad bridge would be the cheaper option if we can make it work. So that's
Sure.
the direction we're headed, but I think there's
And
a lot of flexibility.
we are just about out of time. So this seems like an item that would be worth sleeping on a little bit and coming back at our next discussion to maybe begin with. Before we take any final comments from folks, Jennifer or Aaron, next steps and.
And thank you for that, Dave. We will be going out to the public to get feedback on the recommended scenario and that list of projects as well. So certainly would welcome much more input from TPCC on that. And we're happy to come back and talk more about funding, about programs and policies. We are planning for another pretty compressed round of outreach in late February through about the middle part of March, before we move into creating the draft plan. And then we would have a final opportunity for public review of the draft plan, likely in April, and are working toward hopefully bringing that to TPCC for adoption in May. So that's what's coming next, but we are getting close to wrapping this up. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. This is good stuff. Any final comments, closing words from the committee? All right. Well, a lively discussion yet again. So we'll, Aaron, we're going to have to try again at some point to talk about PL, but that's something that was not all that time sensitive. So we'll get to it eventually.
Yep, and that one will tie in nicely when we come back to talk about the UPWP in June and July. And so I think if it, the long range plan is the priority right now, and we can, as we have time or when we have that conversation about our work program and start looking at our next year's funding and programming, that will be a really opportune time.
Great. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we will likely see you next month. Take care.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dave.
everyone.